Mr. President.
Thank you. I give now the floor to North Suit 21.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Excuse me. Point of order. The distinguished representative of Iran, please. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, for taking the floor again. For the record, I wanted to reiterate that we would follow this case through the NGO committee in New York with a view to prevent such a blatant abuse by some terrorist elements of the human rights mechanisms. And also I wanted to put on record our dissatisfaction with regard to the way of handling this important cause of concern for our delegation. And I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I take note of your statement, and I see Sweden. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Sweden wants to make a point of order with reference to the rules of procedure, Rule 113. The distinguished colleague that just spoke, as far as we know, is not a member of this council. And our understanding of Rule 113 is that delegations that are not member of this council do not speak against rulings of the president. We understood what you said earlier, Mr. President, to be a ruling by you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I take note of these statements. I now give the floor to North Suit 21.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is a joint statement by North-South 21 and the Union of Arab Jurists. Mr. President, since the 2003 invasion and the occupation that followed, human rights violations in Iraq have been widespread and continuing. Reported violations include violations of the erga omnes right to be free from torture, which is, as a jus cogens right, accepted by the international community of states as a norm from which no derogation is ever permitted. But a report of the UN Assistance Mission for Iraq, UNAMI, published in March this year, reports of continuing allegations of torture and ill treatment in pre-trial detention in Iraqi detention facilities. UNAMI's Human Rights Office also received reports of ill treatment in detention facilities in the region of Kurdistan. North-South 21 and Union of Arab Jurists are also concerned about violations of the rights of children. UNICEF reported physical and mental abuse of children and adolescents in contact with Iraqi security forces, particularly upon arrest and during the early stages of investigation. These children are likely to spend lengthy periods in pre-trial detention, in violation of the provisions of the Convention on the Rights of the Child and other relevant standards. Moreover, refugees continue to be subjected to attacks, with as a recent example, the attack on Iranian refugees in the Ashraf camp. UNAMI also points out that in most cases of human rights abuses, the perpetrators of these abuses are not brought to justice. Mr. President, distinguished delegates, it is difficult to understand why the Council does not live up to its professional responsibility to address these violations. It is shameful that His Excellency Miguel Discote Brockman, President of the 63rd General Assembly, had to point out before the Council in March this year that for almost 20 years before the US-led invasion and occupation, there was a special rapporteur on Iraq, but that precisely when the largest human catastrophe on earth began to unfold in Iraq in 2003, this post was eliminated. We reiterate Father Discoto's suggestion to appoint a new special mechanism to report on human rights violations in Iraq, and are hopeful that the Council will place the situation in Iraq back on its agenda with the urgency it deserves. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sweden.
With regard to Iran, the EU strongly condemns the post-election violence and expresses its concern over the high number of arrests of human rights defenders and political activists. The EU calls for the release of all political prisoners.
The Netherlands continues to be concerned about the human rights situation in Iran. We are worried about the excessive post-election violence, the high number of arbitrary arrests, mass trials and detentions of those individuals who merely exercised their rights peacefully in the aftermath of the elections of June 12th. The Netherlands particularly calls on Iran to end the harassment, intimidation and persecution of political opponents, human rights defenders, academics and journalists. We call on Iran to release all persons imprisoned arbitrarily or on the basis of their political views. In particular, Kian Tajbash, Bihan Khajapur and Mohed Ali Dadga. The Netherlands also expressed its concern about reports of human rights abuses in prisons in the aftermath of the elections and calls on Iran to follow up on its intention to shut down the Karizak detention center and close it as soon as possible. The Netherlands is concerned about the large-scale use of the death penalty in Iran and calls on the Iranian authorities to abolish this penalty. We also wish to underline our concern about the continued human rights violations of religious minorities in Iran, in particular the Baha'is, and the judicial proceedings against 7 of their leaders. The Netherlands calls on Iran to comply with its international commitments, such as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and respect the right of religious minorities to practice their faith.
La situation des droits de l'homme en Iran est un autre sujet majeur de préoccupation. Des milliers de personnes ont été arrêtés, emprisonnés, voire torturés, pour avoir simplement osé manifester pacifiquement. Les défenseurs des droits de l'homme, et notamment les femmes de la campagne 1 million de signatures, sont en proie à un harcèlement systématique et leurs activités sont entravées quand elles ne sont pas interdites. La peine de mort demeure largement appliquée, parfois à l'encontre de mineurs. L'Iran refuse toujours de répondre aux procédures spéciales qui ont sollicité une invitation à se rendre sur place. La France exhorte donc la République islamique à respecter ses engagements internationaux et notamment à libérer, sans condition et dans les meilleurs délais, les prisonniers politiques ainsi que les personnes arrêtées au lendemain de l'élection présidentielle.
Thank you, Mr. President. The UK supports the statement made by Sweden on behalf of the European Union. We would like to focus on a few situations which demand, in our view, the urgent attention of this Council. The UK is deeply concerned by the deteriorating human rights situation in Iran, and in particular the increase in executions and the ongoing efforts to suppress freedom of expression and association. The UK strongly condemns the violent reaction of the Iranian authorities towards peaceful protesters and the post-election violence in Iran, including the killing of demonstrators by Iranian security forces. We deplore the ongoing trials of political activists, journalists, lawyers, and human rights defenders, and are alarmed by allegations of prisoner abuse. We repeat our call for Iran to release those detained for participating in peaceful protest, and we are deeply concerned about the conditions in which they have been held. We call upon the Iranian government to uphold their human rights responsibilities under international law and to investigate thoroughly all allegations of abuse suffered by those in detention.
Concerned about the deteriorating human rights situation in Iran, including the mass arrests that followed June's presidential elections and the reported maltreatment of those in detention. We are also disturbed by the continuing ill treatment of minorities, in particular the members of the Baha'i faith, a number of whom have been detained without trial for more than 18 months.
Finally, Denmark is deeply concerned about the human rights situation in the Islamic Republic of Iran. We call on the Iranian authorities to respect and protect religious minorities such as the Baha'is. Denmark further condemns the widespread use of the death penalty and executions, arbitrary arrests, as well as maltreatment of prisoners. Denmark urges the Islamic Republic of Iran to comply with international obligations of human rights.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President. Finally, Mr. President, Australia has long-standing concerns about the human rights situations in Iran, including executions, including of juvenile offenders, discrimination against religious and ethnic minorities such as the Baha'i, and political and media freedoms. Australia is concerned at the human rights situation following the 12 June presidential election, including violence and loss of life, and reports of deaths in detention, torture and rape of detainees. In accordance with its international obligations, we call on Iran to fully investigate all these claims, including ensuring the trials of individuals accused of taking part in protests are conducted openly and transparently. Thank you, Mr. President.